Russia spent 2 years and billions of dollars building it. Three belts of trenches, dragon teeth stretching to the horizon, minefields you could see from satellites. They called it the strongest static defense in modern Europe. And then this autumn, a Ukrainian brigade walked through it, without firing the first shot. The trenches are still there. The dragon teeth are still there. They just don't matter anymore. Here's why. For 3 years, every Western analyst said the same thing about the southern front. The Surovikin line could not be broken. Too deep, too dense, too well mined. In June of 2023, a Ukrainian armored thrust drove straight into it and burned to a halt on the same fields you're about to see again. Leopards in flaming hedgerows, Bradleys flipped on their roofs. Western pundits pronounced the counteroffensive a failure within a fortnight. That was the lesson the world wrote down. It was the wrong lesson, because the people who actually had to walk those fields, the brigade commanders, the drone pilots, the electronic warfare operators of the Ukrainian armed forces, wrote down a different one. They wrote down that armor without sky is a coffin. They wrote down that mines only kill what you can see. They wrote down that a fortress is only as strong as its eyes and its ears. And then they spent 18 months building a different kind of spearhead, not a heavier one, a quieter one. Tonight, that spearhead is 20 kilometers from a town most of the world cannot pronounce, Tokmak. And every kilometer of the road behind it now sits inside a tightening ring of Ukrainian fire. This is the story of how Ukraine's 118th Mechanized Brigade learned to make concrete irrelevant. How a war that began with tanks ended up being decided by software. And why the Kremlin is staring at a map tonight that looks nothing like the one it was looking at in October. This is the death of the dragon teeth. To understand what just happened on the southern front, you have to go back to the map. Not the tactical map, the strategic one. The one that shows you why a single railway junction in a town of 20,000 people is at this moment one of the most important pieces of real estate on the European continent. Look at southern Ukraine. Find the Sea of Azov, that shallow inland sea on the right shoulder of the Black Sea. Above it, you see a strip of land, about 300 kilometers long, 50 wide at its narrowest. This is what the analysts call the land bridge. It is the only continuous stretch of ground that connects mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. Without it, Crimea becomes an island fed by a single damaged bridge across the Kerch Strait. With it, Russia can move a freight train of fuel from Rostov to Sevastopol in under a day. Now zoom in on that strip. Find the rail line that runs east to west. Trace it with your finger. About a third of the way along, it passes through a junction town, Tokmak. Before this war, Tokmak was nothing. A grain depot, a locomotive shed, a few thousand families who worked the surrounding fields. Today, it is the beating heart of the southern occupation. Every ton of artillery shells that lands on Zaporizhzhia, every drum of diesel that feeds the tanks at Velika Novosilka, every replacement soldier who rotates into the trenches near Kamyanska passes through Tokmak. The town is a logistical aorta. Cut it and the occupation begins to bleed. The Russians knew this in 2022. That is why in the months after the Kherson retreat, they poured concrete here on a scale not seen in Europe since the Atlantic Wall. 3 layers of defense. The first, screening positions in shattered villages like Robotyne. The second, the main resistance line anti-tank ditches, dragon teeth kill zones designed by a man named Sergei Surovikin, the general who once ran the air campaign over Syria. The third, deep reserves and rocket positions guarding the road into Tokmak itself. They built it the way the Germans built the West Wall in 1938, slowly, methodically, convinced that depth and density would win the next war the way they had won the last one. And for one terrible summer in 2023, it looked like they were right. Ukrainian armor died in those fields. Western training designed for a combined arms breakthrough against a Cold War-era defense met a battlefield saturated with loitering munitions and minefields 10 kilometers deep. The brigades that survived limped back to their start lines, having gained in some places less than a kilometer of ground. Western newspapers called it a failure. Russian state television called it a miracle of the new fortress doctrine. But fortresses throughout history do not fall to bigger battering rams. They fall when the world around them changes faster than the stones do. The Maginot Line did not fall to French tanks. It fell because the Germans drove around it and used radio in a way the French had not imagined. The walls of Constantinople did not fall to bigger arrows. They fell because the Ottomans had artillery the architects had never planned for. And the Surovikin line is tonight falling for exactly the same reason. The men in the trenches did not get weaker. The drones in the sky got smarter. According to Ukraine's general staff briefings, through late October and into November, the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade, operating alongside reconnaissance elements of the 65th Advanced, along a corridor of roughly 12 kilometers on the Robotyne-Novoprokopivka axis, retaking by the Kiev independents count a string of small settlements along the road north of Tokmak. The Deep State Mapping Project, which is widely cited by Western analysts, including the Institute for the Study of War, registered the change in control over a series of fortified positions that had not moved on the map for nearly 24 months. The Russian mill-blogger ecosystem, Rybar 2 Majors and others, described what was happening in language that is, by their standards, unusually frank. They wrote of platoons going silent, of positions overrun in hours that had been planned to hold for weeks. And I am quoting one widely circulated Russian report here, an enemy that we cannot see and cannot hear on the radio. A Russian platoon commander filed a report last month later, leaked through Ukrainian intelligence channels, and reported in pieces by Reuters and the Financial Times that I cannot stop thinking about. It read, in essence, we cannot see them, we cannot hear them on the radio, we cannot call for fire. And then the shells arrive. That report is the obituary for a doctrine. What the 118th did in operational terms was three things in a sequence. They mapped, they blinded, they struck, and they repeated that cycle position by position for roughly 30 days until they had carved a salient that put their forward observers within direct line of fire of the Tokmak-Polohi Highway, designated on Soviet-era maps as T-0815, and within indirect fire range of the R-280 corridor that feeds southward toward Melitopol and eventually the Kerch Strait. In plain English, they put a Ukrainian artillery officer with a working radio inside binocular range of the road that keeps southern occupation alive. The Russians did what Russians have done since this war began. They flooded the sector with reinforcements. The 58th Combined Arms Army moved units in from the Vermivka direction. Reports from open-source intelligence groups including Defman and Tatarigami suggest at least 3 regiments rotated through the sector in October alone. Russian telegram channels began complaining openly about ammunition shortages on the southern axis, while occupation authorities in Tokmak, according to local Ukrainian partisan reports, and at least one verified video from the Atesh resistance movement, quietly restricted civilian movement on the R-280 south of the town. That last detail matters. When an occupying army stops letting civilian cars use a road, it is because the army needs every meter of asphalt for fuel trucks. It is the logistical equivalent of a man loosening his belt before a fight. It tells you he expects the next punch to land in the gut. There is a second smaller detail that I think historians will return to. In the second week of October, according to multiple Russian telegram channels, including Romanov Light and Voenkor Kotenuk, occupation authorities in Tokmak began moving certain administrative offices south toward Berdyansk and Melitopol. Not the symbols. The mayor's office stayed. The flag stayed. But the procurement officers, the medical logistics staff, the rear area communications hubs, they thinned out. Quietly, in civilian vehicles, at night. That is the body language of an army that has done the math on a town and decided not to keep its valuables there. The Russians have not abandoned Tokmak, but they have started in small ways that do not show up on a press conference to act as if they expect to. This is not yet a breakthrough. The maps still show Tokmak in Russian hands. The dragon teeth still photograph well from Russian propaganda drones, and Ukrainian forces are not, as of this recording, inside the town. But the geometry has changed, and in modern war, geometry is everything. Now we get to the part nobody else is explaining properly, the part that frankly separates analysts who understand this war from analysts who are still narrating it as if it were 1943. Forget tanks, forget infantry charges. Forget the cinematic image of men climbing out of trenches under whistle and smoke. The fight for the Tokmak approaches is at the unit level a fight between 2 competing operating systems, and one of them has just stopped booting. Here is how the Ukrainian system works. It begins with the sky. Above the contact line in stacked altitudes, a Ukrainian brigade now flies what it calls a recon-strike loop. At the top, around 800 meters, sit fixed-wing reconnaissance drones. Leleka Shark Furia variants, feeding live video back to a brigade-level command tablet. Below them, quadcopters with thermal cameras manufactured in basements in Kyiv from Chinese components, and Western processors scan for heat signatures in real time. The data does not go to a paper map. It goes to a software stack called Delta, integrated with smaller targeting platforms like Kropiva and a brigade-built 3-dimensional mapping tool. Every Russian dugout, every supply truck, every antenna mast is geolocated, time-stamped, and converted into a coordinate string accurate to within 3 meters. This is the map step, and by itself, it is impressive. But it is not the breakthrough. The breakthrough is what comes next: the blind. Russian fortifications, however thick the concrete, depend on 3 things to function as a defense. They need to communicate with each other so a unit under attack can scream for help. They need to communicate with rear artillery so that scream gets answered. And they need to communicate with their own drones so the men in the trench can see what is moving toward them. Take those 3 away, and the trench is no longer a defense. It is a hole in the ground with men inside it. Ukrainian electronic warfare brigades units like the 68th and elements attached to the 118th now drive forward behind the contact line mobile EW vehicles with names like Bukovel-AD and Pokrova. These are jammers, but more than jammers. They map the Russian radio spectrum in real time, then drown specific frequencies in noise on command. The Russian commander cannot call brigade. The Russian artillery cannot receive coordinates. The Russian drone falls out of the sky, GPS gone, link lost. The Russian platoon 2 minutes ago, a node in a defensive network, becomes a deaf and blind island. Now the strike. Ukrainian first-person view drones built for under $500 apiece in dispersed workshops across Ukraine fly down the pre-mapped coordinate strings into firing ports, ventilation shafts, the open backs of fighting vehicles. Behind them, conventional artillery, increasingly cued by drone observation, rather than forward observers on foot, drops precision-guided rounds on command bunkers. The infantry of the 118th, lightly equipped, dispersed in squads of 6 to 12, does not assault. It infiltrates. It walks through gaps the drones have opened, past trenches whose occupants are still trying to figure out why their radios are screaming static. This is the cycle. Map, blind, strike, move. And the Russian system has no good answer to any of the 3, because the Russian system was built for a different war. It was built for massed artillery against massed infantry. It was built on the assumption that the side with more shells wins. It was not built for a battlefield where a $40 drone guided by a teenager in a basement 200 kilometers away can disable a $50 million S-300 radar by hitting one specific antenna. There is a number that captures this asymmetry, and it deserves to be said out loud. Ukrainian production of FPV drones, by Kyiv's own figures, cited in the Financial Times, now runs into the millions of units per year. Russian production is climbing fast, but trails and, crucially, Russian electronic warfare doctrine, designed in an era when jamming was a strategic asset, has not adapted to a battlefield in which the enemy fields more jammable nodes than you have shells to suppress with. In other words, the side with the cheap drones and the better software is not just winning fights. It is rewriting what a fight is. The dragon teeth do not get a vote in this. The minefields do not get a vote. The 3 layers of concrete that Surovikin's engineers designed in 2022 were designed against a problem that no longer exists. The Ukrainian army is not trying to break through them. The Ukrainian army is making them irrelevant. And here's the part that should be keeping Russian general staff awake at night. The 118th is not a special unit. It is not the equivalent of Western Special Forces. It is a line mechanized brigade raised during the war, trained by officers who learned the lessons of 2023 the hard way. There are other brigades behind it, the 47th, the 82nd, the 25th Airborne. Each one is now learning to walk through dragon teeth. The doctrine that defeated the Surovikin line is not a secret weapon. It is a recipe, and the recipe is being printed. There is one more layer to the mechanism that I have to spell out because it is the layer most analysts miss: the interlock between the doctrine and the geography. Why Tokmak specifically? Why not somewhere else along the line? The answer is a single Soviet-era engineering decision made in 1966. The railway gauge that connects Crimea to mainland Russia passes through Tokmak because the planners of the Brezhnev era built it that way around the contour of the Azov coast, with a critical signaling and switching hub in the town itself. There is no parallel rail line. There is no functional bypass. Russian engineers throughout 2023 and 2024 considered building one. The OSINT analyst Heimarst documented the surveying work and concluded that the geology of the salt steppe and the time required somewhere between 18 months and 3 years under wartime conditions made it impractical. So they fortified Tokmak instead. They bet that the dragon teeth would hold the town, and the town would hold the railway and the railway would hold Crimea. That bet is now in trouble, because the doctrine of the 118th does not need to capture Tokmak to neutralize the railway. It only needs to put enough drone observation and enough indirect fire on the rail switching yard to make it impossible to operate trains there safely. Trains require sidings, signals locomotives that stop and refuel. They are by their nature fixed targets. A single FPV strike on a signaling junction can take a rail line out of service for 48 hours. Repeated strikes week after week do not destroy the railway. They make it economically irrational to use, and in a war of attrition, irrational economics is how empires lose ground. So the doctrine and the geography are interlocked. The Ukrainian recon-strike loop wins because Tokmak is unique, and Tokmak is uniquely vulnerable because the doctrine has arrived. So where does this go? There are 3 scenarios, and I want to be honest about the probability of each. Scenario 1. Russia adapts. The Kremlin recognizes that the static defense doctrine has collapsed, redirects electronic warfare assets from rear area protection to forward jamming fields its own FPV swarms at scale, and stabilizes the line south of Tokmak through sheer mass. This is possible. The Russian defense industry has surprised observers before, but it would require an institutional pivot of a kind Russian armies have historically made only after catastrophic loss. Possible, not in my reading of the evidence most likely. Scenario 2. The front freezes, winter mud, Western aid uncertainty, Ukrainian manpower constraints, and Russian reinforcements combine to halt the salient short of Tokmak. The town does not fall, but the Russian logistical clock continues to tick because Ukrainian fires now reach the rail node regardless of whether Ukrainian infantry holds the streets. This is, I think, a real possibility. Wars on this terrain tend to slow when the temperature drops. But even a frozen front with Tokmak under continuous Ukrainian fire transfers a logistical burden Russia is poorly positioned to absorb. Scenario 3, and this is where I place my bet. Tokmak does not fall to assault. Tokmak is rendered untenable. Ukrainian artillery and drones make it impossible to operate the rail junction route fuel through the road network or station rear echelon units in the town. Russia, rather than lose the symbolic battle of holding, it quietly pulls logistical functions southward toward Melitopol and the coastal corridor. The land bridge does not snap, it thins. And as it thins, the Kerch Strait bridge already cracked twice becomes not a backup, but the spine. Crimea's supply situation tightens. Russian political risk concentrates in a single vulnerable structure over deep water. The mechanism behind this prediction is not magic. It is the same logic that has governed sieges since the Peloponnesian War. When the defender's supply costs more to deliver than the position is worth, the defender leaves. Russia will not announce a retreat from Tokmak. The Russian high command will discover over weeks that no train can run there, no truck can park there, no headquarters can function there. And one quiet morning, a Ukrainian drone will fly over an empty street. Here is the escape condition, the condition that would prove this analysis wrong. If in the next 6 to 8 weeks Russian forces succeed in fielding sustained brigade-scale electronic warfare coverage that degrades Ukrainian FPV and reconnaissance loops by more than 40%, and if Ukrainian advances along the T-0815 axis stall or reverse, then the doctrine I have described is not the war winner I am calling it. It is a local breakthrough that Russia adapts around. Watch the EW signature reports from open-source intelligence groups. Watch the casualty curves on the south. If those numbers move the wrong way, come back and tell me I was wrong. That is the bet I am placing. The Maginot Line did not fall because the French were cowards. It fell because the Germans had imagined a war the French had not. The Surovikin line will not fall because the Russians built it badly. They built it carefully, expensively, and to the standard of the last war. The standard of the next war was being written this autumn by a brigade most of the world has still not heard of, walking through fields that 3 years ago were a graveyard for Western tanks. Watch the road south of Tokmak. Watch the rail traffic into the town. Watch the Russian mill-blogger ecosystem, which is paradoxically the most honest source of bad news the Kremlin has. If the cycle I described tonight holds map-blind strike move, you will see those signals shift in the coming weeks. A railhead going quiet. A fuel convoy taking the long way around, a general suddenly reassigned. Those will be the first visible cracks in a doctrine that is already broken in the data. If I am right, the dragon teeth on those southern fields will within a generation be a tourist attraction. Concrete sculptures left behind by a way of fighting that no longer exists. Children will climb on them and not understand what they were ever for. If I am wrong, the front will harden, the salient will close, And we will all learn something different about the limits of new technology against old mass. But pay attention to which of those it turns out to be. Because the doctrine being tested tonight in the mud north of Tokmak is not just being tested against the Russian army. It is being tested against every fortified line on every disputed border on the planet. The Taiwan Strait is watching. The Korean DMZ is watching. The defense ministries of every nation that has spent the last decade pouring concrete are watching. A brigade you had never heard of in a town you cannot pronounce may have just buried the era of the static defense. So watch it die. Share this with someone who still believes walls win wars and subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown.